Guys, can you believe it? We are here already. Our final F1 team preview video before the 2026 season is here. It is Mercedes. It is the defending constructors and drivers champions McLaren, a dueling duo going into 2026 here. We're going to cover everything that we have so far in the other previews. If you haven't seen those already, you can find them on the channel below. It is going to be a very fun 2026 season, and I think these two teams are probably going to be some of the most interesting to talk about. Let's go ahead, without further ado, and talk about Mercedes, the presumed leaders going into 2026, and McLaren, the team who are trying to hold on to the top spot. Let's get the party started talking about Mercedes, who finished second in the constructors in 2025. Finished a very strong season for Mercedes, probably the strongest they had in the ground effects era. Unfortunately, now we head back, or I guess not necessarily unfortunately, maybe fortunately for them, we head back to a new era of regulations, which should suit Mercedes a lot better because it is presumed that they are going to be one of the true contenders here in 2026, the first season with these new regulation set. And so it's going to get very fun to follow Mercedes this year. It is going to be very interesting to see if they can hold on and capitalize on the presumed success that they should have going into the season. For this preview, we're going to be talking about the wide range. If you haven't seen one of these preview videos already, we talk about a little bit of everything. We talk about, driver lineups, the biggest questions, concerns, upsides, what narratives are we looking forward to following over the course of the season. But nevertheless, we have to get started talking about the drivers that make it happen, the driver lineup and dynamics for that lineup, as we saw a very fun 2025, the emergence and debut of one Kimi Antonelli paired with George Russell. With the departure of Lewis Hamilton at the end of 2024, it welcomed in a new rookie onto the grid, Kimi Antonelli, who I think delivered exactly what we were kind of expecting, really high highs, but also with some mixed consistency issues as well. Paired along with George Russell, who I think was one of, if not the most consistent driver over the course of the entire season. He seemed to be very steady, and while it seemed like Mercedes had a very high floor, low ceiling type of year, George was always there to take advantage of, moments from other teams to pick up the odd podium here or there and just be a consistent factor in these races and obviously in the constructors. Now, McLaren did walk away with it, but at the same time, finishing second best of the rest is definitely nothing to scoff at when it comes to this driver lineup. Now, when it comes to the experience versus youth balance of this, obviously, George isn't necessarily the oldest driver on the grid, but he's also been in Formula One for quite a few seasons now, a lot longer than some drivers can boast about. And so I think they actually do have a pretty good balance between obviously George's experience, both with his time at Williams and how long he's now been at Mercedes, and Kimi Antonelli, the young, driver going into his sophomore season, trying to build on a very solid 2025 season, but can he start to build that consistency that you realistically need in Formula One? We know he has the speed, but can he do it every single weekend? We're going to get a good opportunity to find out this year. Now that he has a full 24 races under his belt, it is time for him to see what he has in store. Now, in terms of clear number one or number two, I think George obviously still has the reins here, but obviously it is not unknown to those on the grid that Toto Wolff and company really like Kimi Antonelli. And so while I think maybe Kimi might be the long-term play, I think George obviously is still pretty clearly the number one. And who knows, George might also just put in the results that, you can't really even question that. So I think George is very clearly the number one driver going into 2026. Internal dynamics or pressure points, I think this is what we are going to be looking at the most. I'm probably going to touch on this a little bit later in this preview as well. But I think the internal dynamics is for these drivers is going to be delivering when you have a good car under you. Obviously, we've seen in the past Kimi have a bit of moments here or there, and George, while very consistent, has not necessarily proven that given the dominant car that he can deliver weekend to weekend. We've seen dominant weekends when they really, are in a track and a window that suited the Mercedes, but can he deliver weekend to weekend given the pressure of actually having the best car? I think he got a little taste back in 2021 and 2020, but at the same time, it was just a one-off. And obviously he retired from that race over in Bahrain. So it's going to be very fun to follow and see if the driver lineup that they have can live up to these expectations. I'm sure they're looking forward to it greatly, but at the same time, this is going to be a new experience for both of them. And then finally, who's expected to lead development? I think this one is pretty obviously George. Obviously, he's been around for multiple regulation eras, and so he'll have the experience to be able to help them take the next step in their development, especially going into a new era of regulation such as this with such new and interesting aspects. All right, let's talk biggest questions heading into 2026. And I think the biggest question of Mercedes overall is, can they deliver on the expectations placed upon them? We kind of talked about it from the driver's perspective, but now this is sort of the Mercedes as a whole. Obviously, Mercedes has proven in the past that they are able to build winning formulas and winning cars. They won, was it 8 constructors championships in a row, I believe, with Lewis there at the helm. But obviously, going into the ground effects era that we just left, they obviously came and were massively behind the curve when a lot of people expected them to come in and continue to show that they were been able to get on top of these regulations and show and prove that they can have a race winning and championship winning car. This is going to be the first time since, the 2020-2021 season that Mercedes is expected to put together the fastest car once again. And so it is going to be very unique watching experience with knowing that they can do it. But me personally, also spent the entire ground effects era just waiting for Mercedes to deliver and finally get on top of those regulations and start delivering consistent and good performances again. And it just never really happened. They definitely got better, obviously, from the zero pod design before inevitably scrapping it and going back towards the more of the norm of the ground effects era across the grid. But at the same time, they never really got over the hump and were able to build the car to the level that a lot of us expected. So the biggest question that I personally have going into the season is, will they be able to get back to that? Have they lost a little bit of the magic? Will they be able to truly build a dominant car again? Time will tell. This is going to be widely considered to be an engine formula which Mercedes has historically succeeded in. But at the same time, a lot has changed since there was last an engine formula. So will they be able to do it? That is the big question that I have going into this season. And in terms of what must go right for success, I think Mercedes will put together at minimum a car worthy of contending at the front, whether for race wins or championships. That is yet to be seen. But what must go right for them, I think it actually might be more on the drivers than the car itself. It seems, admittedly, I'm recording this after the F1 shakedown, in which, obviously take all of that with a grain of salt. But at the same time, they showed a lot of decent pace, some decent reliability. And I think Mercedes is confident going into preseason testing, which will start here in a couple of weeks or so. And so in terms of what must go right, I think it's going to have to be on the drivers necessarily to deliver, kind of like what I talked about in the drivers and dynamics section. I think George needs to take another step forward into leading a dominant team, and Kimi obviously needed to take his sophomore jump. But of course, all of that is predicated on, will Mercedes be able to deliver like we expect? All right, let's move on now to biggest concern for Mercedes going into this season. And I think it's an obvious one just based on a lot of the factors that I've already talked about. My primary risk for them going into the season is that this engine and engine trick, this compression ratio trick that they have found within the engine regulations, isn't necessarily the skeleton key or master key that a lot of people are expecting. Obviously, an engine formula, a lot can be made or broken in the engine that's in the back. But at the same time, if it doesn't live up or isn't the thing that truly unlocks the rest of it, makes the rest of it easy, the primary concern is that if the engine isn't the ultimate secret formula, then do they have the experience and do they have the capability to build around a more limited engine? As we've seen, they've struggled with the ground effects era to really wrap their head around the aerodynamic situation of the car. If your engine isn't necessarily the thing powering you to wins, do you have the ability to get back to at least building an aero formula that will help you compete or fill in the gaps where the engine might lack? So a lot of people are expecting that the engine will put them towards the front immediately, but will they be able to take advantage? The past 4 years has not necessarily filled me with a lot of confidence. Obviously, with regulation that is all about aerodynamics, they struggled. They did. They struggled a lot. And if they build a really good engine, but really struggle to understand the aero impacts of the car, I think they could potentially struggle a lot more than people are thinking. But at the same time, in terms of most likely failure point if things go wrong, I think development path failures are a very common thing that a lot of people should be talking about. Mercedes, obviously, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here. In 2022, they came with the zero pod design and fully misinterpreted the entire regulation set off the rip, and they had to spend the next years, correcting that path. If they don't get off on at least a decent foot in 2026, they could be in a very similar position of having a dominant engine, but also failing and struggling down the correct development path. So in terms of concerns, I think those are the top of the list for me. All right, moving on to biggest upside though. I feel like I've talked a lot of downers about Mercedes, but at the same time, it is undeniable that the biggest upside for Mercedes, the key strength that they're going to have, is that engine that's in the back. They are widely considered to have the best engine going into 2026, but they also get to be the benefactor in being the engine supplier for these other teams. And so they get the unique advantage of being able to not only develop the power unit themselves, but to develop their car right alongside it. They'll get to be first at the ins and outs of that engine, what it's going to do, the characteristics it's going to have, and how the impact might take shape on the car itself. So in terms of biggest upside, even if they do wander down a wrong development path, they are going to be a half step ahead of their customer teams to be able to recognize and react going forward. And so in terms of biggest upside in an engine formula, being the engine manufacturer is by far and away the biggest upside that Mercedes has, not only with their history of building good engines, but also the advantage they get in a lot of the behind the scenes efforts, as well as as compared to the customer teams, which are only going to get to take a look after Mercedes has already had a very long look at it at the same time. So in terms of best case performance ceiling for this season, I think that the best case performance is that the engine regulation is true and Mercedes really is at the forefront. They obviously are putting out an air of very much confidence. And so in terms of best case performance, I think it's exactly what a lot of us are expecting. Battling at the front, battling for a championship in a new era of regulations, and a return to Mercedes dominance that might bore fans. All right, let's talk competitive window and key rivals for Mercedes. It is no surprise that I think the primary teams they'll be fighting will be the McLarens, the Red Bulls, the Ferraris at the front of the grid. Realistically, this is the pack they've been fighting in, but I think this is realistically where we expect to see Mercedes this year. Obviously, you don't get the benefit of the doubt like they have and not be expected to be competing at the front. That even might be too wide of a window if some of the things in rumors about other teams and failures to find tricks here or there is true, but realistically they'll continue to fight at the front, and I don't think anything is going to change that anytime soon. And in terms of realistic competitive tier, I put them as constructors, contenders, or even preseason leaders. I think obviously no one truly knows what's going to happen until the lights go out in Australia in just a handful of weeks away. But at this point in time, it's hard not to look at Mercedes as the potential leaders and the constructors going into the season. And in terms of is 2026 a setup or a must-deliver year, this is a must-deliver year for Mercedes. I will preface it and spread my eggs a little thin in saying that a must-deliver year for Mercedes this year is not do a McLaren of 2025. They don't need to win the constructors by 400 points. They don't need to win the drivers. Well, I guess I know only one by a couple of points, but they don't need to walk away from the constructors like McLaren did in 2025. But this is a point in time where Mercedes needs to prove that they can still challenge for constructors, build race winning and championship winning cars. This is a must deliver year if their fans and expectations are going to continue to stay as high as they are. Not to say that they'll fall back into the pack of the midfield, but this is, I think, a moment in time which kind of teeters for Mercedes a little bit. Not that they're going to fall off, not that if they don't deliver this year, they can't in the future, but we're reaching points where the Mercedes hype around building cars has sort of cooled over the 2022 to 2025 seasons. It is now time for them to step back up and be the elite of the elite in the sport. So that will be interesting to follow, and I, for one, cannot wait to see what happens. All right, let's do it. Season expectations and some minor predictions. Let's go ahead and kick off their best case scenario. And obviously, I think the best case scenario for Mercedes is they come out of the gates firing. They win races off the jump. They truly have the best engine. They are able to take advantage. Their drivers are able to deliver on that car that's underneath them. We see a bit of a faster Kimi Antonelli, and honestly, you kind of just need the same George Russell, just with a little bit of a better car underneath him. And I think the best case scenario is that they're able to build a solid gap as compared to the rest of the grid, sort of like what we saw with McLaren at the beginning of the 2025 season. Just build a nice little gap, and then you have a bit of leeway here or there to try things, go down your development path and see what works from there. But I think in terms of best case scenario, they build a sizable lead at the beginning of the season and are able to hold off the rest of the field down the stretch at minimum, or potentially even walk away with it if they get it truly correct. On the flip side, worst case scenario, I think I mentioned this earlier, but the worst case scenario for me is that the engine is good, that the engine might be the best on the grid, but the aero or other components are what let Mercedes down, and they kind of get mired around in that upper, in that top group, and sort of mired in a bit of inconsistency and sort of hovering around that first to fourth range, depending on the weekend that it is, and they sort of feel the pressure to sort of get it corrected really quickly. And so I don't necessarily expect to see Mercedes potentially even as low as like fourth in the constructors, but at the same time, I think inconsistency might be the worst case scenario for them. Not that inconsistency isn't expected, because obviously going into a new season, we're not going to see the reliability that we did in the last era of regulations, especially with these new power units that are going in these cars. But at the same time, in terms of inconsistencies, in terms of performances and results that may not necessarily make a lot of sense, we're not having the very easily explainable ones like a power unit failure or anything like that. It's just it doesn't make sense why they're not delivering consistently. I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at. Of course, the most likely outcome, I think, is that they'll use their engine to sort of jump out to a lead quickly, and then be able to have a bit of a buffer to continue to develop, just trying to stay ahead. I think the engine will make a lot of difference this season. I think we've seen some inklings. If we believe what you want about the F1 shakedowns, you saw pretty decent reliability across the board, but I think Mercedes definitely has a leg up as of right now, and it might just come down to the teams underneath them. But in terms of most likely scenario, I think Mercedes will be able to build a bit of a gap at the beginning of the season and try and hold the other teams at an arm's length. I don't think it'll be a thing where they'll lead from Australia all the way to Abu Dhabi, but at the same time, it feels like a situation where we'll see Mercedes sort of separate at the front and be there or thereabouts by the time the season finale rolls around. And then finally, expected constructors finishing range. I have them between first and third. I don't necessarily think we'll see them fall potentially even lower than third, and so I think Mercedes would take that. Obviously, I think they're shooting for first. And then finally, we have our one storyline to follow for Mercedes in 2026, and this is the one that I teased earlier. Will Mercedes actually go back to dominating the sport? And if they do they still know how to? I think they've lost a lot of key personnel over the ground effects regulation era we just left behind. Do they still have what it takes to dominate the sport? Obviously, we've seen them move up over the course of 2022 to 2025. They were able to move forward on the grid, ultimately finishing second in the constructors this last season. But if they are given a dominant position, do they still know how to be the cutthroat, ruthless Mercedes that we had come to expect over their, back-to-back constructors titles? So that, I think, is going to be what I'm going to be watching for probably the most this season, to start that storyline, just because I find it fascinating to understand and see if they can still do it, because I'm sure they went into the last era very confident and obviously left it with more of a whimper than anything. And then in terms of this season, driver, technical, or organizational focus, I'm actually going with technical here. Obviously, going into an engine formula, I think the technical side is going to get very, very fun to follow. Obviously, I think that will be where a lot of this is made or broken. And I think it could be good. And honestly, the power units are going to be all the talk at the beginning of the season. And me personally, I think it's for good reason. All right, guys, that wraps up Mercedes. Only one team remains. It is our reigning drivers and constructors champions, McLaren Formula One team. All right, guys, it is constructors champions, the reigning drivers champions as well. McLaren Formula One team obviously won the constructors last season, and the overall team direction I have for McLaren right now is obviously a contender. they had the benefit of walking away with the constructors in 2025, giving them a lot of extra time to focus on the 2026 car. They also get the benefit of having the Mercedes power unit in behind the drivers. So it is an opportunistic moment for McLaren to continue to dominate the sport like we saw in 2025, and time will tell if it happens. But let's go ahead, kick things off with our driver pairing and dynamics. Obviously, nothing is changing in the McLaren team. You have Lando Norris, reigning World Drivers' Champion, and Oscar Piastri, a Drivers' Champion contender last season. Obviously, this driver pair might be one of, if not the strongest on the grid at the moment. You have Lando with a buku amount of experience underneath him, and Oscar at this point also is becoming quite the experienced driver at the same time and has consistently gotten better year over year. In terms of experience versus youth, I think we are moving into an experience over youth dynamic for McLaren. Obviously, Oscar is going into, be his fourth season in the sport. Obviously, in his third season, challenging for the championship already. I think he is only going to be hungrier to, continue to develop, continue to get better, faster, and more consistent as he chases down his first driver's title as well. In terms of the clear number one or number two driver conversation, this is the most fascinating conversation the entirety of the 2025 season, because McLaren had spoken week in, week out that they have no number one driver. And it is probably one of the most interesting dynamics that we've ever seen, because there were many instances in 2025 where that became a painfully obvious, much to the dismay and confusion to the entire Formula One fandom. So going to be such an interesting thing to follow in 2026, going into a new era of regulations, because no one really knows what's going to happen until it does. And I think McLaren might have boxed themselves into a very interesting corner with the way that they're handling their two drivers. I think that leads right into the internal dynamics or pressures. I think the biggest pressure point between the drivers, or at least in terms of the driver lineup, is how the 2025 championship really unfolded. Obviously, Oscar Piastri leading, honestly, the majority of the season. I think it was 16 out of the 24 weekends he was leading the championship, before ultimately just going on a really weird dry spell there at the 3/4 mark of the season. Had about 4 or 5 races in a row which just did not suit him at all for whatever reason, and ultimately he finishes third after leading for a majority of the season. So it'll be very curious to see if that does impact the season at all. I think ultimately probably not, but in terms of dynamics between the two drivers, I think that is still going to be weighing both on the drivers and the team's minds, to say the least. And then finally, who is expected to lead development for this car? I think it'll be both. I think at this point, both drivers have, the experience underneath them to help deliver, the feedback to help them develop the car. So I don't think necessarily one will particularly take the lead over the other. Let's talk biggest question going into 2026. The biggest unknown that I have for McLaren is, will they be able to parlay the dominance that they had in 2025 into this new regulation set? Obviously, I don't think it would be too, undeserving to expect them to continue to challenge at the front, but at the same time, they were able to build a championship winning car in the old regulations. Will that then translate to being able to do the same thing in the new era of regulations? They do get the benefit of having the Mercedes engine, like I mentioned before, and a lot of extra time in the background to probably research and, develop this 2026 car. But just there's so many still unknowns about what's going to happen, and will they be able to do it? We've seen them have really slow starts to seasons before and have to make course corrections. Obviously, 2025 was a bit of an outlier there, but even as early as 2022, 3, and even 4, we saw them have really slow starts to seasons. And I don't know if this is the type of season where you can realistically get behind the 8 ball like that. So it will be very fascinating to follow that one as the season goes on. But on the flip side, what must go right for success? I think the biggest thing that must go right for them is that they were able to utilize the extremely large, gap they had in the constructors in 2025 to their advantage. They obviously had probably about half a season's worth of time to dedicate almost wholly to the 2026 car. They have a lot of opportunity there to work the ins and the outs, really try and figure out the secret sauce to at least starting out the season here in 2026. And if they're going to have success this season, I think that must lead to a decent start in this season. I don't know if they can necessarily have a slow start like they did in 2024 even, and have to be playing catch up the entire way, because at that point they'll have to develop quickly, and that's, I think, kind of where mistakes can happen. What you really want to do is do what they did last year, which is build up a buffer and then be able to use that buffer to your advantage to really get into the nitty gritty and truly wrap your head around the details. So in terms of what must go right, I think using and utilizing that experience and time they had last year to their advantage. In terms of biggest concern, we're going to parlay kind of what I just ended with the what must go right. I think the biggest concern is those slow starts that we've seen in years past. Obviously in 2025 being the outlier there, but in the entire last regulation set, I think there were many instances of them showing up to the season kind of behind the eight ball a bit, sort of behind the pack and having to play catch up. The biggest concern is that they won't be able to, utilize the advantage they had last year, being time, and putting themselves at the front once again. Will that happen? I'm not sure, but I think that is the biggest risk or concern that I have for McLaren, is that they've shown a propensity for having slow starts, and if they do that again, they could just be spending even more time playing catch up. And so will it happen? I'm not sure, but that is my biggest concern for McLaren going into the season. And in terms of the most likely failure point, if things do go wrong, is car development. I think if you're behind the eight ball, kind of like what I talked about, if you have to rush development, that sometimes can be where mistakes come in, where you misinterpret a piece of data because you're trying to rush it through. You don't get to take your time and really wrap your head around it in its entirety. Is that going to happen? I'm not sure. But in terms of concerns, I think it's a pretty big one. It can't all be doom and gloom. Let's talk biggest upsides, key strengths and advantages. Obviously, McLaren has proven that they have a driver pairing which are willing and able to dominate seasons. We saw in 2025 large swaths of consistency from both drivers. Oscar Piastri led the championship for, no, I guess I can't say the majority of the season, but at least over half the season. And Lando Norris obviously was consistent and good enough to win the championship. So they have a driver pairing that has shown the ability to be able to take opportunities and run with them to win races, grab podiums, compete for championships. That is actually a bigger upside than I think people give a lot of credit for. Having a driver lineup that has been there, done that, is invaluable as you continue to develop a new car and a new era of regulations in a team that is still continuing to try and grow and cement themselves at the top of the sport. They have shown that. And also, as much as I talked about their propensity for having slow starts, they've also shown the ability to make improvements as the season goes on. They have shown the ability to be able to take disadvantages and make them advantages, to have slow starts and to increment the car forward up the grid. And so even if they do get behind, they've shown the ability to then move forward. So that is actually a big upside. It is a skill, and they have shown that they can do it. Now they just need to prove that they can do it from the beginning. And then in terms of upside and their best case performance ceiling, I think I see them very consistently finishing on podiums, challenging for race wins. I think they're able to at least hold serve in terms of their position on the grid. And I'll keep talking about it this entire video. Their Mercedes power unit, very well considered to be the best on the grid. They are going to have it in behind them, and while they may not have the advantages that Mercedes had, having the behind the scenes looks, at the same time they are going to have the best engine and a lot of extra time and development for the 2026 car. So that in itself is a big upside. All right, let's talk competitive window and key rivals. You're going to be hearing a lot of very similar things to what we just heard with Mercedes. In terms of key rivals, you obviously have Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull. That top pack I don't think is changing anytime soon, especially following the success that they had in 2025. I don't necessarily see them falling too far down the pack unless they get it really wrong, obviously. But for my expectations, I still expect them to be finishing towards the front, consistent podiums probably, and challenging for race wins, especially in this first year in the new era. They're realistic, competitive tier at the top, best of the best. Obviously, they've proven in 2025 they can build a championship winning car, and I don't think there's any expectations of them falling off any time particularly soon. And then finally, is 2026 a setup year or a must deliver year? I'm pegging them as a must deliver year. I think in terms of the momentum you're able to build as an organization, as a race team, They won the championship handily in 2025. They won the Drivers' Championship after admittedly probably cutting it a little too close, but at the same time, they need to transition that into delivering on a new era of regulations. We've seen them be able to move up the entirety over the course of an entire regulation cycle, but if they can get off to a good start, they have shown the ability to continue to march forward and actually dominate the other teams on the grid. So I think this is a must deliver year in the same way that Mercedes is. It's not necessarily you have to win the championship, but you must deliver and not have these major setbacks that have plagued you in the past and caused you immense pain and pressure to try and catch up. If they can get off to a good start, I think that is a big thing. And I think they need to do it this year if they want to continue to fight for championships. Here we go, season expectations and some predictions. The best case scenario I have listed for McLaren is that they continue their momentum from 2025 and actually do challenge for both the constructors and drivers titles. I think this season is a little bit wide open in terms of that in itself. Obviously, until we see any indication of what these teams are able to do, I think it is relatively open. I think there are definitely some top contenders. In terms of best case scenario, I think McLaren puts themselves right there in contention for both. Obviously, time will tell, and it might come down to just reliability issues or incidents here or there that might do it there as the season winds down. But I think best case scenario for McLaren are truly sticking towards the very top, sort of challenging for race wins consistently, winning races, gaining a lot of podiums, and challenging for both championships. But at the same time, worst case scenario, I think the worst case for them is they probably very similar to Mercedes, where coming out with the wrong aero philosophy and then the Mercedes engine not being able to sort of bail them out. I talked about it a lot with the Mercedes. I think it's very similar here. It's hard to really truly look at worst case scenario for these types of teams because they truly are expected to compete at the top. And so worst case scenario for them is, I think, kind of a Mercedes of 2022 situation, where if they have a decent engine but just really struggle to understand the aero balance and aero philosophy, I think that could really set them back, especially if they dig their heels in down the wrong development path like we saw in Mercedes last time. And so worst case scenario, I think it could be that. Obviously, I think that still would put them, I think, probably still within the top four, but maybe not necessarily as much challenging for the championship, but probably maybe even still challenging for podiums here or there. But most likely outcome, I think they come out of the gates, challenging for podiums, maybe getting a couple of wins here or there. And then I think the first big litmus moment will be their first couple rounds of upgrades. And I think that will really direct the path for the rest of the season for them. So I see them consistently battling at the front. Obviously, time will tell, but more than likely, I think they'll be able to use the Mercedes engine and all of the extra time and resources that they had to develop the 2026 car to their advantage, and we'll see them fighting at the front pretty easily, I would say. And then finally, expected constructors finishing range. I have first to third. I don't really want to shoehorn them into one or two spots. And so first to third, I think, is a pretty solid one. It's obviously going to come down to just who has the most consistency and who can deliver when it matters most. And then finally, our final one storyline to watch for this entire season, the single narrative that I'm going to be following for McLaren this season is how will McLaren handle the new era of regulations as well as their drivers? We have asked so many questions over the last 2 years of McLaren, and I think a lot of those are still very prevalent. How they handle their drivers, how they handle team orders has been a very hot topic of conversation over the last year, definitely. Will they continue to do something similar? Time will tell. I expect them to, because they have talked nothing more over the last calendar year about how they have no true number one. It is going to be they support both drivers equally and determine to allow them to race and let them decide who gets, the results when it's all said and done. Will that translate into a new regulation era where there might be a lot of inconsistencies across not only the grid, but also just sides of the garage? Time will tell. Time will tell, and we're probably going to be asking a lot of these same questions this entire season as well. So it's going to be so much fun to follow, and I, for one, can't wait to see what things come out of Zach Brown's mouth as we go down this one as well. And then finally, our driver technical or organizational focus for this season. I also have technical here. I think the drivers are pretty well established, and I think organizationally, I think McLaren is about as set as one could be. And so this is all going to come down to, can they deliver on the technical side? Everyone's going to be watching them like a hawk, being the Constructors champion like they were in 2025. And the first round of upgrades, I think, are going to be some of the most interesting, because I think we'll see some teams rise, some teams fall, and it could be a very, very fun year to follow for McLaren. Guys, there we have it. All 11 teams have officially been previewed going into 2026. The only things left for us to do now is wait for preseason testing to roll around. I, for one, cannot wait to see these cars on track once again. We got snippets from the secret shakedown, but I think preseason testing will truly be where we start to see our expectations realized one way or another. But that is for a later point. What did you make of the Mercedes and McLaren previews? Where do you expect these teams to finish this season? Let me know down in the comment section below. And if you have any concerns or any upsides that I might have missed. Up next, in terms of leading up to the 2026 season, we have our official 2026 season predictions coming out in but a week from today. Be on the lookout for that. And as always, a little teaser here, our Community Predictions Championship is going to be happening again here in 2026. If you're interested in joining our Predictions Championship, you can head to the Discord down below, and you'll have all the details there, as I'll be getting all of that set up for 2026 as well. Guys, it's going to be a lot of fun. Be on the lookout for season predictions next weekend. And if you haven't already, subscribe. And if you made it this far into the video, leave a like rating, because it really helps me out and will continue to grow our little community. But guys, the 2026 season is just around the corner, and I, for one, cannot wait.